So I want to welcome everybody here to tonight's seminar presented by 50 by 30. We want to welcome all members and new members of the 50 by 30 team, as well as all of the candidates for mayor, regional councillor, and municipal councillor who are joining us tonight. We're very pleased to have the presentation, this webinar with Liz Benneian, who's known to so very many of us, has been very active in the Niagara region for, I believe, at least 8 years, advocating for a variety of environmental issues, and was very active in other regions before this, and was an editor for a number of years. So Liz, I'll hand it over to you. We're looking forward to this presentation. Thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks for being such a big part and meaningful part of the 50 by 30 team. Go ahead, Liz.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Herb. Hello to everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Liz Benneian. I am a former journalist, newspaper editor, who has been working on environmental initiatives and leading community groups since 2004. And tonight we're going to be talking about how we can green our region. And I'm going to be relating it to the climate emergency and how we can deal with the climate emergency as well. So my background, I have a degree in science, and I work for an organization that is a charity called Ontario Green, and we do environmental education in classrooms and communities. And I've given more than, I don't even know how many presentations, but to over 80,000 students around Ontario. We have more than 30 different presentations that are available, and we provide the presentations for free. I also recently worked on creating a large butterfly garden as part of the new park in Beamsville, the Rotary Park, right in the center of Beamsville. And I've led community tree planting initiatives. I've spoken at urban forest conferences. And I've done a lot of work too in terms of looking at development, looking at EISs, environmental studies, and also evaluating different planning plans that have come forward. So I've kind of got a well-rounded background in sort of urban planning, environmental issues, and that kind of thing. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. And Herb, I know you said 25 minutes. I'm going to be racing through it at that. Give it my best shot to do 25 minutes. So we're going to be talking about greening Niagara, mitigating the impacts of climate change, providing a more attractive and functional public realm, and improving biodiversity through urban and rural forest policy. So we can achieve a whole lot of things. You know, we used to think of environment and environmentalists as kind of, you know, sort of nice to have things that are kind of on the fringe. Well, now we know it's kind of absolutely essential if we want healthy communities and if we want to meet the challenges of climate change. So this presentation is going to provide some solutions for improving Niagara's tree canopy, and it'll talk about how that can help the region to achieve both climate adaptation and mitigation goals, and also provide, as I said, many other benefits. Of course, the region and local municipalities cannot do this alone. We need a full press on this, and that means the municipalities will have to work together with the NPCA, the Conservation Authority, with environmental groups and with citizens organizations, and also with private landowners. We're going to look at some observed issues within our urban forests and look at policy measures that have been used in other communities to address them. Our urban forest management practices absolutely have to change so that Niagara's residents can reap all the benefits that healthy urban and rural forests provide. We often get asked how much canopy and how much natural area is enough. And the bottom line is Environment Canada says 30% tree canopy is the absolute minimum. And if you have 30%, then that will support less than 1/2 of the potential number of species that could exist in that ecosystem. 40% is much better. 50% gives you the the most likelihood of being able to support most of the potential species for that area. So 30% should be the bare minimum. So Niagara's cover right now is 17.5%. We know that with certainty because the region did studies as part of their new official plan, and that's the region's own figure, 17.5%. So I think that the region really should be looking at creating a plan right now to add a minimum of 13% by 2030 and a further 10% by 2040. A lot of times you hear, well, we can't do anything because we have to do a study and we have to see how many trees we have, and studies are all fine and good and we absolutely need to do them, but that shouldn't stop us from taking action. Right now, we know we don't have the tree canopy coverage that we need, and so we need to take action on that and get the, that can be informed as we move ahead by the studies as they come along, but we shouldn't use studies as an excuse to stop action. And the region needs to start putting some money aside for regional tree planting. And also working with the municipalities. Again, we need a full court effort on working together to establish good urban forest management plans. We can't do it if every municipality is kind of doing their own thing. The urban forest doesn't care which municipality it's in. So we need to manage it as a whole on a watershed basis. So why does Niagara's habitat matters so much? Well, it matters because our region includes Canada's most biodiverse and most threatened ecosystem. So we're in what's called the Carolinian zone. It's only 1% of Canada's land base, but it's also the most diverse. So it has more life in it than any other ecoregion. However, it's also Canada's most imperiled ecoregion. So only 15% of the original natural landscape remains. And this picture is actually, it actually seems to show more natural space than actually does exist. Because if you look carefully at the legend, you'll see that it's only the darkest green spots that are actually what's on the landscape. And the other lighter green corridors are areas that Carolinian Canada is looking at for potential enhancement and to create corridors that maybe right now don't exist. And when you look at this map, you'll also notice how important our area here in Niagara is in terms of protecting what is left of the Carolinian landscape. A lot of what is left is here in Niagara. Niagara's habitat matters because we don't have the habitat, you lose species. So there are altogether, when we think about endangered species, we tend to think about tigers and rhinoceros and all kinds of things that don't live here, but 125 different species, that's plants and animals, that are native to the Carolinian zone are on the endangered species list, 125. It includes things like the spiny soft-shelled turtle. In fact, all 8 of our turtles here in Ontario are now on the endangered species list. Badgers, there's only, they think, maybe 200 left in all of Ontario. The Acadian flycatcher there on the endangered species list, the Fowler's toad. And that beautiful blue butterfly that you see is actually extirpated. So that is a creature that should be here and no longer exists here in Ontario. Niagara's habitat also matters because if you don't have the natural spaces, you lessen the region's ability to mitigate the effects of and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I read a few days ago about a European city that was using its parks to manage flooding. They were redesigning their parks so the parks would be able to manage the floods that are being expected as the climate changes. And so I went hunting for that, and I didn't find that city, but I did find something that's going on in Boston. So there's something called Climate Ready Boston, and they're creating a plan to have a network of, this is really interesting wording, landscape-based defenses. So basically what they're doing is they're changing their waterfronts and their parks to manage flooding. The cost is going to be big. It's going to be 142 to 262 million over the next few decades, but it's expected to prevent losses of $1.3 billion. So it's an investment to protect against losses. And that's the way I think we have to regard our green and all the other climate measures that we need to take, because they're investments to protect against future losses. So a good example of the kinds of things that, you know, here in our own region we should be looking at is Merritt Road. So we need to first and foremost protect what we have. And so if we have wetlands and we have significant woodlands, we should be protecting them. That's the first thing. It's hard to rebuild things after they're lost. We need to protect what we have. So Merritt Road is a road that is in Thorold. Right now it stops this area where you see the dotted pink lines. That's where the road doesn't go right now. And what the region would like to do is both expand the road that does exist to 4 lanes, and then they want to extend it across where you see that dotted pink line. You can see from this map, which shows the natural heritage features in that area, that the problem is that we have significant natural features both to the north and the south of that road. We have provincially significant wetlands and we have significant woodlands. And so these are exactly the kind of projects that we shouldn't even be considering. We have to protect what we have. And in this case, there are roads to the north and to the south of Merritt Road that traffic could be directed to. And, you know, when we're talking about climate change, encouraging driving is not something that we're supposed to be looking at. We're supposed to be finding other modes of transportation and other ways to manage the traffic that we do have. All right, the second most important thing we need to do is we need to enhance what we have. So we need to remove invasive species and we need to plant a wider variety of native species within our existing parks and natural spaces. The third most important thing that we need to do is create new parks. So municipal governments have to stop taking money in lieu of park creation in new development areas. Niagara has the second lowest amount of park space per person in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And during COVID, we saw our conservation areas completely overrun, our parks and our beaches overrun because people were desperate to find places outdoors to recreate. And that problem is only going to get worse as our population continues to expand. So it is so important to create parkland and natural spaces as we develop. It's not about stopping development, it's about accommodating all these other things that we need to accommodate. And, you know, when it comes to the parkland, as you can see, second lowest in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, we need to do something about that. We need to plan for parkland and natural spaces, and we need to stop taking money in lieu of parkland. So our local ecosystems rests largely on the planning and policy decisions of regional and locally elected officials. Now, I know the province has had a lot of, they've been doing a lot of stuff in the last couple of years, and I'm sure they'll be doing more to kind of dismantle a lot of the environmental protections that we had. But still, there is a lot that rests on the shoulders of our locally elected officials. So on the region side, we have the regional official plan, designates the natural heritage system throughout the region. It sets density targets for development so that we're concentrating development in already existing urban areas and not spreading it out into the remaining agricultural lands and natural areas that we have. It sets woodland management policies. It creates transportation plans, not very good ones in when we're talking about road. And it also can foster green development standards. We haven't really been looking at that in our region in a major way, but in the new official plan that's coming, there are some standards that are being set in there, but we could do much better. And I'm going to talk about green development standards more later. Local municipal authorities are responsible for plans that designate natural areas within the municipalities. They create zoning policies to decide what kind of development is going where. They can determine how much tree protection is happening within the municipality. We'll talk about tree protection bylaws in a second. And it's also up to them about creating new parks and natural spaces. And municipalities can also create green development standards. So what are green standards. Well, they're good planning policies that are the best tools municipalities have to lower greenhouse gas emissions and also to build better communities. So they're measures created by municipalities to encourage environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable design. They're comprehensive principles that are integrated into the planning approvals process, and they guide development at a level of planning and design that focuses on the community as a whole. So just on the environmental side, just as an example, green development standards in Toronto require certain soil volumes and certain soil quality to support tree growth. And that's hasn't been standard practice. Here we build a road and all the construction debris that's left over from the road gets thrown to the side of the road. And then we come along and we dig a hole and stick a tree in that. And now we're trying to make a tree grow in compacted subsoil that's full of construction debris. And we wonder why we can't get good street trees. So some cities, Toronto included, but other cities as well, have put really strict standards in about soil quality and quantity so that we can get good street trees. The green development standards in Toronto require 1 tree to be planted for every 5 parking spaces. They require watering requirements for trees. They require pervious surfaces, in other words, surfaces that allow the water to filter through so that we don't have these deserts in our community, which is basically when we over-manage water and try and get it all away as quickly as possible instead of allowing it to percolate down through the soil, we create deserts in our communities. And they also require the planting of native plants. But green development is just about trees and that kind of thing. They're also about trying to lower GHGs. And so I think this is the most important part of it. So in Toronto, their green standard is used to implement council's net zero by 2040 climate strategy that limits GHG emissions and ensures all buildings constructed by 2030 are near zero emissions. We don't have anything like that here. There are minimum set standards with developer incentives to adopt suggested higher standards. So Toronto is actually on the 4th version of their green development standards. So when they started off, they had a minimum requirement for all developers, and then they had another level of development that was a higher level of development that would reduce GHGs more, that were stricter about environmental things. And they provided incentives for developers who wanted to go beyond the minimum standard. And then over time, that minimum standard fell away. What was the higher standard became the minimum standard, and they set a new higher standard that developers were incentivized to try and reach. And then that fell away. So you see how they constantly evolved it, always giving the development community an idea of what was coming next and what they were going to be expected to achieve, and always giving them some time to do that. So they're in the 4th version. And I really suggest if anyone is interested in seeing what we could and should be doing in terms of creating green development standards, to go and take a look at Toronto's. All you have to do is put Toronto Green Standard in Google, and you will find the pages for that. They're not the only city to do it. Small places like Halton Hills have created green development standards. Other cities like Ajax, they've created green development standards. So this is the way of the future, and this is how we get to achieve our climate goals. In Europe, they have something similar in some places, and it's called the urban green factor. And so they set a specific target that they want development applications to meet, and they judge them on that. And then if they don't meet it, for example, you see the development proposal above, it didn't quite come up to the standard, which I think is they have to achieve 40%. And so then they looked at it and said, well, if you added green roofs to all those buildings, we get to 0.41%. And so that's what they did. So it's the same kind of thing, just done a little bit differently. And it's really, you can see the effects of that green factor on the street. So what you're seeing at the bottom of the page there, that's the top of a parking garage. And it's all been planted up with native plants. the picture that you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner, you know, that would be something, an area that in many of our municipalities would simply be asphalted over, but they've created a little natural garden there. And then you can see the wall, the green wall that's above a subway station and on the side of a building. So these are the kind of things that are happening. In some other countries, they just make things simpler, and they say they should have the 330-300 rule, which is every single person should be able to see 3 trees from their window. Every citizen should live in a community that has a minimum 30% tree cover, and every citizen should be no more than a 300-meter walk to the nearest park. If we want to protect the trees that we have, we need to start valuing trees as community assets, and we need private tree bylaws. And I know communities have been very hesitant to pass private tree bylaws. The problem that we have is that developers and private property owners, homeowners, are regarded exactly the same in the law. They're exactly the same. So what usually gets people upset is when they see somebody buy a property that has lots of trees on it, and then the next thing you know, every tree on the property is down. And then the developer, after they've clear cut the site, goes to the town and submits a site plan. That's the first chance the town has to look at what trees should be saved, but by that point, there's no trees left to save. So to prevent that, to prevent the wide scale cutting of trees before the town even has an opportunity to review the site plan application, you need a tree bylaw. The trick with a tree bylaw is to make sure that it doesn't overly impact your average homeowner who just wants to maintain their yard and who maybe wants to put in a pool or whatever. You don't want to overly impact them, but you want to be able to have some control over large scale tree removals. And so as much as people are concerned about tree bylaws, they are effective, and overall communities support them once they see how they work. And I know this for a fact because I worked really hard to get the first private tree bylaw in Oakville, and it's only become stricter since then. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel with tree bylaws. There are many cities that have had them for years and years, like Oakville. You just need to borrow them. You don't need to make them up. You just need to borrow them, and they're effective. If we're going to start valuing our trees for their community benefits, we also need to look at how we can evaluate all of our natural assets and have them evaluated for their benefits. You know, a tree provides erosion protection, it provides shading, so it helps mitigate the heat climate effect, which is going to be even more serious as the climate continues to heat up. When you're looking at a wetland, it's providing flood control. So these natural assets that we have are providing all kinds of services. But until recently, we haven't even tried to evaluate what those services are worth. And if we started to evaluate the worth of those things, then maybe we could manage them the way we manage our hard infrastructure, so our gray infrastructure. So there actually is now a way to evaluate these things. And it's called Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. They can be studied, they can be evaluated for their real dollar value, and then they can be managed appropriately. The green infrastructure can be managed like our gray infrastructure is. And then if we know what the value of them are, maybe we wouldn't be so blasé about their loss. And if we know what their real value is, then we'll want compensation if we do have to lose them. So just for example, trees. If trees are valued as community assets, then the community has to require compensation for their loss. And a superior method of figuring out what a tree is worth is looking at the leaf area of any trees removed and comparing it to the leaf area of any trees that are replacing it. And so when they did studies on this, they found that you needed 13.7 trees to compensate for a large tree and 3.1 trees to compensate for small trees. And if municipalities have compensation plans for trees, I don't think any of them are that high. A lot of times it's one, some of them don't have any, some of them it's 1 for 1. But in any case, there's nothing like what you're seeing here, 13.7 large compensation of smaller trees for 1 large tree. And in fact, when they started looking at other factors and putting other factors in, like what was the mortality rate of a large tree that was healthy compared to a bunch of smaller trees with a slightly higher mortality rate, they actually got up to a 41-to-1 ratio for replacement. So we really need to start valuing the trees for their green infrastructure value, and we need to have their loss compensated for adequately. So this picture looks like a logging camp in northern Ontario, but it isn't. It's actually a suburban lot in South Oakville. And it was one of the pictures that we used that helped us get a tree bylaw in Oakville. All those trees were removed from one site. And this is something we're going to face more and more here in Niagara as we intensify in our already existing communities. Developers are going to come in, they're going to buy that small house on the large tree lot. They're going to want to take all the trees down and fill the lot line to lot line with new buildings. And we have to start thinking about that. And I don't think any of our municipalities have actually quite come to terms with that yet. When studies have been done about tree loss due to intensification, they have found substantial tree loss. So even just trees that are supposed to be retained are being lost. In Ottawa, it showed that 50% of the trees that were supposed to be retained were actually lost during development. A Toronto study showed 56% tree loss on redevelopment sites. A New Zealand study showed a 35% decrease in tree canopy over a 10-year period as infill development started to happen. So this loss is going to happen as we intensify. We need to figure out how we're going to mitigate it, measure it, mitigate it, find compensation. All right, so one of the things I hear from people all the time is, well, where are we going to plant trees? We don't have any room to plant trees. We don't have any, we don't have enough space to add all these extra trees. And I think that's just not true. And so if you're looking at the region, for example, a lot of our regional roads look like this one. There's no trees along the roads. And it's actually a safety hazard in the winter because a lot of snow blows across those fields and gets into the road. We could use planting all along those roadways. We could plant up our regional properties, and we could have the region provide money to the conservation authorities specifically for tree planting. There could be, I know the NPCA is already doing this, but there could be even more work of doing riparian buffer planting along our creeks and streams. This would have so many benefits. Help mitigate climate change and help control flooding and erosion and improve biodiversity. It would also help to improve Niagara's groundwater, which consistently rates a D in the watershed reports from our Conservation Authority. We could also conduct within enhancement areas that are part of our region's new natural heritage system and within the significant woodlands that are already within our regional plan. Now, again, our forests as they currently exist are not in very good shape. So even though they may appear green, there's a lot of invasive species in them, a lot of older trees that are at the end of their life, and they consistently, again, rated D in our conservation subwatershed reports. So a lot of work could be done on what we already have. When it comes to our urban forest, we have a lot of challenges. So there's inadequate, as I mentioned, soil, there's root damage from adjacent construction, lack of sufficient water, inadequate growing space, vandalism, damage from mowers and weed whacking, disastrous pruning. However, all of these challenges can be overcome if we employ the right policies and practices. one of the things that municipalities can and should do is they should require appropriate tree planting and mulching. So that picture you're seeing in the middle, I'm sure you've seen this a million times out in your community, this volcano mulching. The mulch piled up against the trunk of the tree, which promotes mold and rot. It should never be like that. It should be in a donut shape with no bark touching the tree and no more than 4 to 6 inches at the most around the tree. So if we just had standards for our tree planting and made sure there was enforcement of those standards, it would go a long way. Also, one of the big killers of trees is these poles that they put on them, and then they attach the wire to hold them when they're first planted, and then nobody remembers to go and take that off. I've seen so many trees strangled by those. And of course, inadequate planting, as you can see on the picture of the left, on the left. Being left on trees, when these plastic tags are left on branches, they'll eventually strangle the branches. Trees that are planted and then there's no water and maintenance. You know, as a taxpayer, when I see all these trees being planted badly mulched, with the tags left on, planted sideways, planted too low, all the things that I see, no water, no maintenance, it just annoys me because that is so much taxpayer money that's going into it a lot of times, and it's just being wasted. You know, maybe last a year, maybe 2, and then they have to be replaced. It's just a waste of money. We need to put better standards in place and enforcement of those standards. Another big problem we have is, and whether it's contractors doing it or whether it's, you know, summer staff that's hired and they're not careful, it's weed whackers. They do so much damage to trees. And as I mentioned, the ties being left on strangled trees. Trees that, you know, have failure to thrive, as you can see in these examples, those trees are probably 5 or 6 years old. And then they're planted and they die. And it's just such a waste of time and money. And we also are planting the wrong things. We're planting a lot of non-native species. We need to plant more native species that support local creatures. The tree that you're seeing there on the right-hand side is a ginkgo. It's a tree from Asia. Yes, I know it stands up to urban issues pretty well, but there are native trees that could be planted in that spot. We need to create watering and pruning and maintenance plans for trees. And I mentioned weed whacker damage. Here's some great examples of it. Go to any newly planted park after there's been maintenance and take a look at the bottoms of the trees, and you'll just see they've been hacked to death by the weed whackers. Those trees will not survive that damage. We can solve that problem very simply by putting tree guards on trees, and also, you know, with making sure contractors who are doing the work who are doing it properly, or training staff. We need to make sure that the large street trees that do exist are protected from adjacent construction and have really strict guidelines about that. You know, I've seen fencing put up around existing street trees, so those are trees. And then I've seen, you know, the contractors ignore the fence, pile up stuff against them, run heavy machinery into them, just completely destroy the trees. So we need some enforcement of some of these measures as well. There's really very little knowledge I find out there in the general population about the value of planting native trees. And I always give this example, so anyone who's heard me speak before has heard me say it, and so please forgive me for it. But just as an example, white oak trees can feed almost 500 different native species. So everything from little larvae that eat its leaves that in turn feed our birds, to big things like squirrels and deer and even black bear that feed off the acorns. 500 different native species supported by white oaks. We've planted Norway maple all over southern Ontario. It's about 14% of our urban tree canopy, and it feeds virtually nothing. So it's like creating a big black hole in our environment every time we plant it. And there's numerous examples just like that. Ginkgos, for example, support not a single native creature. Every time we plant things that don't belong here and that nothing here feeds on, we are diminishing our biodiversity. In fact, it's so bad now that there are many bird species that cannot find enough larvae, because that's what 95% of our bird species feed their young, can't find enough larvae to feed their young. And that's one of the things that's contributing to the decline of our population. So we really need to start planting the things that belong here and that support our species. In terms of creating tree canopy, we can also set goals. For instance, we need to set goals and we need to set reasonable timelines for doing that. This is just an example of a bunch of communities that have done that and some of the ways that they've done it. I won't go through it. We can encourage tree planting on private. There's only so much that municipalities in the region own. A lot of the land is in private hands, and that means working with private landowners to encourage tree planting. There's many different ways it can be done. There can be friendly competitions between businesses and awards for businesses that tree their property. For residents, there can be tree giveaways. I know my own community in Lincoln has started to give that. I know St. Catharines does it, for example. And there can be projects like Reforest London or Mississauga's Million Tree Project, which I think I'm going to talk about in a minute. We need to understand again the importance of soil. If you don't have healthy soil, you can't have a healthy tree. You can't plant trees in compacted subsoil and expect them to thrive. For every street tree that we're planting now, about 50% will make it to 15 to 20 years, when some of those same species could live over 100 years. So if we want to maximize our investment in tree planting, we need to make sure that we have appropriate soil. I won't go into this in any detail, but the bottom line of this was we saw a whole bunch of trees in Oakville that were not growing. They had been planted 3 years ago and they looked like miniature trees. And when they tested the soil, they found it was compacted subsoil. In some cases, it was harder than cement. And the trees just had roots circling around and around because they couldn't get out into the soil. So they did a whole bunch of remediation work just as a test to see if they could get the trees to grow. And it proved to work. But you know, the solution is not to try and remedy it after the fact, it's to prevent it in the first place. And soil and conditions really matter to trees, and you can see that dramatically in this picture. These trees are exactly the same species, planted at exactly the same time. Of course, the ones on the road are confined in tree coffins. They don't have as much water getting to them. They're susceptible to the salt spray and the pollution from the road, and you can see the difference that it's made. Since we have so little space to grow things, and since it's so important to provide the right species, we should concentrate when we're planting on the highest value plants. So the ones that have the most biodiversity value, the things that will feed our native species. In Toronto, in a major shift, Toronto is actually requiring some developers to source native plants from local seed sources. So they're really taking it one step further than anything that's been done so far. Lot standards. This picture on the bottom left-hand side, I took that years ago in Oakville. But so many parking lots look like that, little tiny spaces that, you know, no tree is ever going to grow in. If we want to green our communities, we need to have some green parking lot standards that will allow for tree growth. And we need to look at pervious surfaces, so surfaces that allow the water to percolate through and down through the soil to help nourish the plants. We also need to look at naturalizing our parks. So many of our parks are barren, cut lawns, and they're not interesting. They're not helpful to biodiversity. I would much rather be in parks that look like this than, you know, mowed spaces. That doesn't mean that we don't need some plain mowed spaces. People want to throw a ball around every once in a while. I get that. But we should be looking at trying to naturalize at least 25% of our parks. We can engage the community with all kinds of things like Mississauga did with its Million Tree Challenge. So everyone who plants a tree can then put it up on the website and it shows where the tree was planted, and it shows how the city is doing in terms of reaching its goal to plant 1 million trees. There are all kinds of other things that can be done in terms of creating publicity campaigns to make the community more greener and biodiverse, holding seminars on native tree planting. And then communities can partner with all kinds of different groups. In London, for instance, they have a group called Reforest London. They do tree giveaways, literally going door to door with trees. They'll hire a bunch of summer students. They'll load up wagons, as you can see here, with trees that are native trees, and they'll literally go door to door. And when a house doesn't have a tree on the front lawn, they'll say, do you want a tree? We'll even plant it for you. And they get trees into the ground. So as we have continuing development pressure, there will be a loss to Niagara's existing tree canopy and natural areas. And as that happens, it'll take all the climate mitigation, adaptation, social health, and infrastructure benefits. So it's more important now than ever to create policies and plans to improve the health and increase the planting of our urban and rural forests. And I sped through that at a record rate, and I apologize for going so fast, but I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has about any of that. Thank you.
Well, and thank you very much, Liz. You only went 20 minutes over your speaking allotment. But I had sent you a comment in the chat that you could speak for as long as you wish. So yeah, so thank you for that excellent presentation. And for those of us new to 50 by 30 Niagara, you might notice that we're a bunch of policy wonks and policy geeks over here. That was fantastic. Thank you. So yeah, let's open it up to questions. We have 42 participants. So all right, let's have a look here in the comments. There's a fairly extensive one from Desmond. Excellent. Hello, Desmond. Rachel asks, when developers pay a green space offset, where does that money go? Liz, do you have any idea?
Well, as far as I know, it goes to general revenues. So you're talking about, you know, in lieu of parkland, they pay in lieu of parkland, that goes to general revenues. It doesn't, in most cases, it doesn't go to a special parkland fund.
So, okay, so yeah, when this green offset is paid, it's just going into the big pot, and it's not actually being put towards, you know, buying trees to, you know, fill in a park or anything like that.
Yeah, there may be exceptions to that, Rachel, but if there are, I don't know of any.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And Sandra O'Connor, I believe this is Councillor O'Connor from Niagara on the Lake, asks, how was the 17.9% Niagara canopy calculated? Is this both urban and rural?
Yes, it is both urban and rural. So exactly how the region came to that conclusion, I'm not sure. I don't know all the methods that they used, but that is the region's own figure, and it was urban and rural.
Okay.
Listening to this for a few minutes.
Oh, him. What are you doing there?
Oh,
Hey?
John, I think your mic is on. Can you?
Okay.
Yeah,
This
thank
is
you.
happening right now.
Thank you, John. Jessica LaHaye asks about a private tree bylaw.
Can you
Could we
see
not?
me?
Camera's not on.
Hey?
Camera's not on.
Can you see me?
No.
Somebody else has their microphone. There we go. All right, we turn that on. So Jessica LaHaye is asking about the potential for 2 private tree lot bylaws, one for developers and one for homeowners.
You can't. Homeowners and developers are exactly the same in the law. A developer is only a developer once he starts developing.
Yeah.
A developer is a landowner, just like a homeowner is a landowner.
Yeah.
So they're the same in the law. You can't have a separate, there's no way to separate them.
And yeah, because I would imagine that if a piece of land is owned, there's no way to tell whether or not it's owned by a developer, right? It could be just owned by under a person's name or under a corporate number. There's no way to tell that it's a developer. So you simply have to have a uniform law. That, if I'm understanding that correctly. John Backer asks, toughening the 15% policy is a good way to further more woodlands. That's a comment. All right. Thank you, John. And Sandra O'Connor points out that Niagara-on-the-Lake has a tree bylaw for the urban private lands. And I think you said the other day that Niagara-on-the-Lake is the only municipality that has a tree bylaw. Is that right? Or did you say Niagara Falls has one too the other day, Liz?
No, as far as I know,
Yeah.
Niagara-on-the-Lake is the only municipality that has a private tree bylaw
Okay.
in Niagara. There's lots in other communities. All over Ontario, there's lots of private tree bylaws, but in Niagara, as far as I know,
Yeah,
it's Niagara-on-the-Lake only.
one thing that jumped out to me in your presentation was that you made the comment you'd like to see us reach 30% by 2030, and then add another 10% in the next following years to bring that to 40%. So that would mean that we're adding almost 2 percentage points of growth a year. And that's not even 2% of the 17 that or 18 that we have right now. That would be going from 17.9 to 19.9, doing that per year. How feasible do you think that is? In my own reading, it seemed that a lot of municipalities seem to be growing at about in the 1 to 2% range. But yeah, what are your comments about that?
I think I think it's a really ambitious target, and it may not be achievable, but I think that's what you should aim for. And I think that if you really got the public engaged, and that's where I think regional and local governments come in. You can't do it all by yourselves, but if you can act as leaders and engage with the public and get the public moving, like everywhere I go, I'm always looking at trees. So everywhere I go, I'm seeing spots where we could have trees. You know, I see a lot of yards around Niagara that don't have trees in the front yard. There's so many places where we could put trees where we're just not. So I think it's a very ambitious goal. Do I think it's achievable? Maybe not, but it's certainly worth, you know, setting your sights on trying to achieve it.
Thank you. What I really appreciate as well is the number of community groups that are active in this, and I love the idea of the tree handouts and the natural trees. I was not aware until this presentation about how much native trees feed the population and then non-natives don't. The business about the Norway maple is well, it's kind of, yeah, it's heartbreaking. I planted I have a very small inconsequential garden. A friend of mine grew some really beautiful flowers, so he gave me some seeds for them, and I planted them, and they are gorgeous. But I have absolutely noticed that no insects go to those flowers, not one. They're all over all the other ones, but they're nowhere near these these beans that I've got. But yeah, so that's a really significant thing. The other piece that I'll just quickly add, and there's a few more comments in the chat, is that we went to my parents-in-law's woodlot and pulled saplings out from underneath the tree canopy and put them into our own yard here. And my sister-in-law did that too. A municipal staffer told me that if you want to buy a tree that's 10 years old, they have to pay $1,000 at the nursery for that. And yet here we went to our in-laws and got gorgeous saplings for free, and then planted them, and they're doing well. All right, I'm gonna, John Backer, easiest way to boost the 15% is completion of naturalization that is underway. Yeah, this is another reason to restrict sprawl. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. I know this from the Conservation Authority about a decade ago, did mapping where they the whole MPC area, which they show the area in forest habitat and also that's regenerating. The regenerating area was mapped in yellow. And if you just allow these yellow areas to, complete their naturalization, the 30% goal will be reached, and you will get about a doubling of forest cover. And even in the meantime, these habitats are valuable for certain species. They're not, wasteland or scrubland. There's birds like the black-billed cuckoo that's a declining bird. They benefit from this type of habitat. So these aren't wastelands. And the one threat to these lands, as I said, is urban sprawl and other types of non-agricultural development. The lands are returning to forest. They tend to become abandoned because they're heavy clay, and they may have been made sense to farm in the horse and buggy age, where agricultural machinery was less expensive. And with climate change, that has even accelerated this, because the heavy machinery that is generally used now, you can't get on the land when it's wet. So we, should recognize this as a good, trend, and encourage it through, sound policies.
Thank you, John. That's a very good point. And it's hard to believe it, but it's almost nice to hear that we can benefit from heavy farm machinery like that. Yeah. Rachel Symington asks, are we aware of grants available to plant and manage new trees? Liz, are you aware of anything like that?
There are some grants around, but I have to say that a lot of sources for these kind of projects have dried up. Trillium Foundation used to fund a lot of these programs, and they just don't anymore. They're doing other things, but there are still some grants around. TD Friends of the Environment, and those kind of things. Smaller grants, not big grants, but they are available. There's some around, and one of the benefits of partnering with local community groups is a lot of times these are sources of funding that municipalities can't apply for. But community groups can.
Okay. Wally Braun asks, so I'll just read out his question or his comment. In my research, I found that the Toronto tree bylaw is among the most progressive while still accommodating private homeowners. Could you perhaps comment, Liz, in comparing this to Oakville? So yeah, do you know what about Oakville's tree bylaws and green development standards?
So I can't compare them because I'm not super familiar with Toronto's tree bylaw. So I'm afraid I can't make that comparison.
Okay. Well, can you tell us a little bit about Oakville's tree bylaw? Are you familiar with that at all? Maybe not in comparison, but just...
Yeah, I don't want to.
That's
I'm
all right.
hesitant to do that only because I don't have the details right in front of me, and this was probably 14 years ago that we fought for the original bylaw. And I know they have toughened it up since. One of the things that's outstanding about the bylaw is the fines that you can get for ignoring the bylaw. So they're hefty and they're cumulative. So if, it's not like a one-time offense and you get slapped with a $10,000 thing. It just keeps adding up and it's very steep. So I would look at that portion of it anyways, the fine portion of it.
Sure. Wally, do you have a follow-up question for Liz?
Yeah, on that point, I would note that Toronto's bylaw is perhaps unique in that it has at least half a dozen separate subsections, and it covers private property, it covers ravines. So for an example, you cannot cut anything in a ravine, whether it's publicly or privately owned. At the same time, homeowners' needs, as Liz mentioned, are accommodated in that somewhat disappointingly, trees under, I think it's either 10 or 12 inches diameter, I forget which, are not covered at all. But anything above that, in order to put in an addition, you need to apply for a permit. And, like Liz says, fines are substantial, the bylaw has teeth, and it covers private property. So my follow-up on that would be to the mayor, actually. So how about it, Marv? Is a tree bylaw covering private property owners in the offing for the future in the town of Pelham?
Wally, you're taking over my agenda again.
Okay, admit it.
We're going to go to Colleen's question, which I think is great. And Councillor O'Connor, I want to give you an opportunity to speak from Niagara on Lake's perspective, if you would like to. And if after that, if Marv wants to speak to Wally's question, we'll do that. So Sandra, Ms. O'Connor, how does that sound? Would you like to tell us a little bit about the Niagara on Lake tree bylaw?
Yes, yes, I would. Thank you for the opportunity. It was a long time in coming, and it's not perfect by any means, but it is a start. And we are trying to build on it. It does need to be strengthened, of course, but it does address all of the, we looked at Toronto, we looked at Oakville, and we tried to take the best of both, but without overreaching, because our first step was to get it in, which we did. And it has been helping a lot. One of my concerns is the appeals. People do have an appeal mechanism, and I wish it was more robust in upholding the decisions that staff have made. So that's one thing I would like to look at. The other thing was with regards to the fines. What we have done is put it under the AMP system, which is a fining system for any kind of municipal infractions instead of it being on its own. So I wasn't too keen on going that way. So that's another weakness. But as I said, it is a start, which I'm very pleased that we were able to do that. If you would allow me, I would like to make one comment about Norway maples and Manitoba maples, because they're on our list of ones that are not considered best species, and we wouldn't consider them for planting now because of all the things that Liz has talked about. But we do have a number of them that are large and mature. And they do offer a lot in the way of cleaning the air, providing cooling, and shade, maybe not the greatest for biodiversity. So I wouldn't want to go out and cut these mature Norway maples down and replace them with a smaller sized, more a local species. I think that should be preserved for any new ones we were putting in. They should be a local species, but I still think some of the larger ones are not, especially if they're on the municipal roadway, because they're very good for salt in the winter, and they're very good if they're on the roadway, they are confined and they wouldn't be too invasive. So it's sort of like, from my perspective anyway, a bit of a balance with them, sort of a love-hate type relationship.
So I first wanted to just say, Sandra, that I totally agree with you. We shouldn't be cutting down mature trees, including Norway maples. I have one in my front yard. I didn't plant it, but it was there when we bought the house, and it's a huge tree, and I would never think of cutting it down. So it's not about getting rid of those mature trees that exist, that are not native, but as you said, not planting any more of them. Let's try and plant as many native species as possible.
Yeah, and the reason why I did raise that is because I have heard of municipal staff saying, well, that one mature tree could come down for a driveway because it's only a Norway maple. And I want them to think beyond that when they're making those decisions.
Thank you very much, Councillor O'Connor. That's very helpful. I want to get back to Colleen's question because it talks about lawns. She asks, is there a way to move communities away from the default of manicured lawns? If fines can be issued for not keeping a lawn short and neat enough, could there be fines for cutting and weed whacking too much? Or what else can we do about to encourage people to to have natural flowers and natural grasses, greenery on their lawns instead of manicured lawns? Liz, I'm sure you've thought a fair bit about it.
Yeah, so again, I think part of it goes to municipal leadership. We need the municipalities to be leaders in terms of helping to educate the public about the value of planting native plants and having naturalized landscaping. And they could do that in part by naturalizing some of the parks, but also in, hosting seminars. And I've worked with some of the communities in in Niagara, including Lincoln and West Lincoln and a few other communities, to do presentations on native plants. The other thing though too is a lot of our municipalities have bylaws that actually wouldn't stand up in court. So bylaws that restrict people from all kinds of things, from planting plants at a certain height, or bylaws that make people feel like they need to mow. There's been several recent court cases where such bylaws were challenged, and the court has always found in favor of the homeowner. So as long as it's not a safety concern, we're not talking about allowing, a whole bunch of tall things to be planted right at the curb. As long as it's not a safety concern, and as long as the homeowner is maintaining it, and that can mean, it's clearly been designed so that there's pathways and there's maintenance going on. A bylaw against natural plantings would not stand up in court. Now, of course, when it comes to native plantings, it doesn't have to look wild. You can use native plants just like you would use regular nursery plants and have as controlled a garden design as you want. And you can also have a more naturalized looking garden design. So I think, Colleen, to answer your question, it's our municipalities showing leadership. It's about changing bylaws that restrict people from creating naturalized landscapes. And it's about all of us educating each other about the value of planting with native plants.
Thank you very much, Liz. And Marv, I see your hands up. Do you want to respond to Wally's question?
If I could, I'd like to respond to a few items, misconceptions. At the very best, let's call them misconceptions. Number one, when a developer pays dollars instead of parkland, and I'm only speaking for Pelham, that money is not going into a general pot. That money must be used for parkland in other areas of the town. So it does not disappear. That's the first thing. Secondly, the one reason that they do not plant trees along major roadways is because the trees will act as snow fence, and the snow will stop on the highways instead of blowing right through, and then create accidents, cost more money to clear the roadway. If you do plant trees along the road, what happens to the salt that gets plowed onto them? We had, and the good news is that there are indeed salt tolerant trees being developed. So perhaps that part of the argument doesn't work or won't work as genetics get improved. But that is why you see wide open spaces next to highways so that the snow does indeed blow all the way across. You put trees on the side that the wind is coming from, it acts as a snow fence and the snow drops on the roadway. One other thing I'd like to comment on, of course, I farmed all my life. In order to make a living on this heavy clay, you have to respect it. And farming in general has made huge steps in the last 20 or 30 years by going to no-till. We used to think that we had to beat the hell out of the soil in order to get anything out of it. And I'm happy to say now that with huge advances in no-till equipment, that we don't do that anymore. It's I see hay fields being sprayed with a herbicide, and we used to plow those fields. They were left bare over the winter. The wind would come along, blow a lot of topsoil off. Now we don't do that. It's just you spray it down with a herbicide, and then you go in and you plant a crop right where the hay field was. So the one, again, I'll go one last, I'll be the bad guy again. Heavy equipment on clay soil. You think back 40, 50, go back 100 years when people farmed with horses. What did they plant? 5 acres a day, whatever. So they had to get on the soil sooner in order to plant the crop. Now the machine we are using, heavier, yes, but they're planting 200 acres an hour, or at least 200 acres a day. So they don't have to get on the soil so fast. They can wait until the soil is in better condition, it's drier, so they don't compact it as much. So now, after saying all that, let me say that I'm hoping that in the after the next election, I'm hoping that Pelham will sign up with Vineland, who is doing great stuff down there. I can't talk about Vineland enough. I mean, over the years, what they've done for genetics in fruit trees and what have you to help Niagara's farmers, and now they're putting that same know-how into trees. And I'm really hoping that our municipality, I believe Lincoln has already signed on. I don't know what other municipalities have, because to have an institute like Vineland doing the research, what it takes for a tree to survive in an urban setting, and the care that has to be provided to that tree to get optimum growth. Those are things that unfortunately public works people need a plan. And we don't have plans. I'm sure we don't have plans on tree care. And to have someone with authority like Vineland Research saying, okay, this is your soil type. They'll actually come and do a study on your soil. This is your soil type. Where you're planting that tree is going to be high exposure to salt. This is what you have to do. And we were very fortunate in our little town of Fenwick. We had some trees that weren't doing well, and we had a greenhouse fellow actually stopped me on the street and gave me quite a beating down. And I said, well, you know, John, why don't you take this area and I'll send Public Works out. They will talk to you, and you tell us what we have to do. And boy, we ended up with totally different trees that are downtown Fenwick, and they're really advancing quite well. So I think that is one thing, is the promise of Vineland. I think every municipality in the region should jump on that program, and maybe we do have an arborist on site now, which is okay for trimming trees and what have you. And supposedly he should know how to grow a tree, but I can't help but think that we should be sending our public work guys to seminars to get a hold of this knowledge. Anyway, I hope I didn't come across too negative, because I love trees. Don't get me wrong. My son just bought the farm off me, and he's already talked to the NPCA about planting 3 or 4 acres of forest adjacent to a forest, and we really understand the benefit of them in the farming community, I believe. So anyway, thank you very much. And Wally, always willing to have a conversation with you off mic. Thank you.
Well, thank you
The
very much,
off-mic
Mark.
situation can be fixed real easy.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for responding, Mr. Mayor. It's, I've commented in response that I've noticed that the region puts up a snow fence every year on Merrittville Highway and other roadways with adjacent open fields. So you know, your observation is well taken. So you know, perhaps we can agree that it's of the essence to plant the trees on the appropriate side of the road to avoid the you know, the snow drift issue. Because on one side of the snow fence, there's accumulation, on the other side, there's not.
Exactly, exactly.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Marv, for your comments. And yes, if you have arborists that would like to go to a seminar, I'm sure Liz would love to present a webinar and seminar for them. But yeah, your comments were also very informative and well taken, because as I go across, drive down roads, I notice that it feels like there's lots of space. You'd want to have them far enough so that cars aren't driving into them either. But even so, like we live really close to Crosley. Our son went to Crosley. My wife went to Crosley, and along that road, it feels like there's quite a bit of room there too. But yeah, thank you for your comments. Tim Lamb in the comments points out that if I'm reading this right, the city of Port Colborne has an environmental initiative where if the community member buys a tree that has been approved by the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority guidebook, that the municipality will give a $50 rebate. So that's what one municipality has done for trees, which is very, very cool. There's a bunch more questions here at the bottom. I'll keep on. Yeah, there's a number of comments. Is there a best, Angela Little is asking, is there a best strategy to mandate expanded targets for parkland within urban boundaries as development intensifies? Liz, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I don't know if anyone's come up with sort of a best target or how to achieve it.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm not sure. But you know, so often when I'm reviewing development applications, I see, you know, the payment in lieu of parkland and that kind of thing. And it's concerning. It's concerning to me. You know, I don't see the appropriate amount of new parkland being accommodated in a lot of the new development applications that I've reviewed over the last many years. And perhaps I'm spoiled because before I lived here, I lived in Oakville for 10 years. And Oakville had a parks guy, the head of their parks department, who many years ago, when development started coming north of the original main part of Oakville, he said, we're not going to allow development in parks in the ravine areas. We're going to protect the ravines. And the city agreed with him, and they protected the ravines from development. And what that ended up meaning for Oakville was that they have a system of trails that are walkable from any neighborhood in the city that go alongside these ravines. And it's a beautiful trail system. You can walk from the lake all the way up to Milton. You can walk all the way across Oakville, east to west on these trail systems. And that's only been improved upon by the natural heritage system now that they have in the north, which was the first natural heritage system in the province that I also fought for. So I was spoiled by that. I was spoiled by having walking trails everywhere around me and beautiful ones and beautiful little forests all throughout Oakville. And as much as I love Niagara, and I do love it, you just don't have that in many of our communities. And so I just see what it could be if we would plan for it. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to hear you and also read some of the comments and the questions that are being given. But we're also past 8 o'clock. Yeah, we're at quarter after. So I think we'll call this the formal end of our conversation with Liz. For all of our council candidates, well, for everybody who's tuned in, we want to have these webinars every few weeks or so. Want to do a webinar in about 2 weeks, hopefully with one of our local community designers, somebody who is actually going to be, their company is actually working on what was the target site in Welland at the mall, turning that into a high density mixed use community development. And they're going to give a presentation on mixed use design and development within our municipalities here. So we'd love to see you at that again. If you receive my emails, then you'll be hearing about that. It was great to have everybody here. If you need to take off, all the best, wish you well, and we'll talk to you soon. And if you want to stay tuned into the conversation, please do, and we'll listen to Wally's next question in a second here. But all the best, wish you well. It's been very good to have you here with us this evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Wally, what do you got?
Yeah, thanks, Herb. Yeah, in response to Angela's question, I presented to both region and local council on this issue. One of the best strategies, I think, is to mandate underground parking in almost every circumstance, and in particular in for any commercial zoning. When new buildings go in, there needs to be parking underground so that it alleviates the need for parking above ground. The space formerly dedicated to parking then becomes available as green space, if that makes sense. So I was hoping to get a response from the mayor on that. I noticed his hand was up, but I think he may have left the meeting.
He was listed as iPhone, so I don't see iPhone here.
Correct.
Yeah.
So perhaps Liz could respond as, would that be a strategy that you see as being responsive to the need for more parkland instead of parking spaces?
So I lived in Europe for 5 years, and Europe is notable for not having nearly the amount of surface parking that we have here. Underground parking is relatively common, but then they also have really, in general, much better public transportation systems too. So the problem is it's much more expensive, of course, for developers to dig down to put the parking lot underground, and that's the major issue. And until recently, land has been fairly cheap here. Maybe it is still cheap. And so it's been worth it for them to spread the parking lot out over the landscape. I think that's changing. We're seeing minimum requirements for parking spaces going down. And I think that's changing a bit. But yes, it would be a lot better if we had a lot less surface parking. We give up too much public space to cars.
Exactly. And I think you're exactly right that, the amount of space we dedicate to parking is an indication of exactly how cheap land is here. And the solution I would suggest is to find a way to tax land as we might tax any other resource. As you pointed out, Liz, it's a valuable resource and we need to put a dollar value on it. Right now, developers are getting it for free. They're paying no tax on it, and they're reaping windfall profits when municipalities change the zoning. So I would suggest that the best time to do that is at the point where urban boundary expansions are applied for, and attached to the land stipulations with respect to both underground parking and to address and to have at least 2 stories above all strip malls and commercial developments for residential development, with a portion of which would be could be dedicated to affordable housing. So when we use our land much more efficiently and find ways and means of doing that, we can achieve multiple environmental goals at the same time.
Thank you, Wally. Sharmila, you had a couple comments in the chat section, and you got your hand raised right now. So Sharmila, please go ahead and welcome here.
Thank you. This is not in regards to my comments in the chat, but to always note that in the times of reconciliation, we should be aware of the impacts that they have on everything that we're doing, including where we are at with the environment. But this is just in regards to the parking, and just to note that I believe it's Hamilton, because when I looked into this, that's doing stacked parking. And so you're going to need to have some surface parking, but how are we doing that? And even the spaces in the buildings, the condos, etc. So that is one solution that I believe is being tested here. It's already very viable in Mexico, and I've seen that in the city, in Mexico City itself, where they're using stacked parking, and you see it. They have the attendants that are pulling in, using their car, using the technology. So it is out there, and it is the will, and it does look to the bylaws that are created in terms of some of those minimum standards. So just kind of in response to what Wally was saying, and in terms of some of that underground. And this is some of the forward thinking we do need as we're developing new complex, new areas where you could potentially dig down and you have a bit more space to, I guess, to plan differently for some of these considerations. And I just think of Spain and some of the, some of their public space where it's in the main port, but the parking was built underground. And then, of course, accessible parking, is available, but the primary parking is underground.
Thank you very much, Sharmila. Good comments. And Sandra O'Connor, go ahead.
Thank you. My battery's going low, so if I just fade away, that's what happens. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say something about the parkland, cash in lieu of parkland. Often there are different philosophies on council with regards to developments, whether there is sufficient, like the 5%, if that is sufficient to sustain a park, or should that be put aside with another development to purchase land to make a larger park. So I know in Niagara-on-the-Lake, we do have a dedicated, it goes into a separate pot of money, but that is one of the things that we struggle with. Should we have a number of smaller parks in many of the areas, or a larger park? Me, I'm of the philosophy that we should have smaller parks that are walkable to the people in that particular area, but I'm constantly going up against the others who want to have a much larger park that can sustain many more activities. So that is a struggle that we are looking at. I just wanted to raise that. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Neal asked a question in the chat about replanting trees, so removing trees. If a parcel of land is being developed, can those trees be dug up and placed elsewhere? Liz, do you have any experience with that? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know how you would get them to do that, and it may not be that successful. So that would be very stressful for trees. Not that it's not possible, but it would be stressful. And you'd have to have a good place to put them. So, and finding the same kind of conditions, and it's difficult. And I don't know by what mechanism you would get someone to do that, because it would be an expensive proposition. So how would you get the landowner to do it? It's certainly not something that's required anywhere in any of the acts, policies. So I'm not sure how it would happen.
Yeah.
One of the things I have been involved in, though, I can say, is that plant rescues on a smaller scale, not trees, but we did have a relationship with the town of Oakville, where if there was a development site, like a woodland, for example, and they knew that the development was coming, they would allow groups of us to go in and rescue plants that would then be planted elsewhere.
Neat. Yeah, I know that I've seen the giant excavators that will like dig up a root ball. They have these massive forks, but given that a tree's roots will go to its drip line, they're not actually capturing very much of that root ball. So I have no idea, but I wonder what the survivability rate is when you dig up a mature tree like that and plant it elsewhere. All right. Well, Wally Braun says that moving mature trees is routine in cultures that value them. And there's a link there for those of us that want to go look it up. All right, I don't see, okay, Wally's got a raised hand. Oh, and go ahead, John. We're gonna go to you first.
Thank you. In response to the Mayor of Pelham, we don't need to wait till a genetic invention for salt-resistant shrubbery.
Okay, go ahead.
One thing I know from the experience of City of Toronto, the snowberry bush, it survives the most horrible salt spray conditions right now. Also, the type of soil that I was referring to, I feel rather insulted the great length he went to, refute the point I was making, is Welland clay soil, which is not found in the town of Pelham. It's not around where he is in Pelham. It's in the area south of the Welland River. It's this former glacial lake, Lake Tonawanda, laid down these heavy soils, which is why you tend to have good forest cover there and a lot of wetlands. And with climate change, the problem is the challenge of farming these areas has become more severe because you tend to have longer and wetter springs, and it's more of a challenge to get the machinery out in time to do planting. And the farmers, because they're educated, they've abandoned these lands for good reasons. It does not make economic sense to farm them. And I saw this when I did field observation on the Speedway proposal in Fort Erie that went down. And all the areas like floodplains and all that, the farmers had the sense to allow native trees to go out and revegetate the area and abandon it from farming, and so it didn't make sense to farm them. So this is happening for a number of reasons, in part because the farmers are all, much better educated and trained in, science than they were in the past. One of the another challenge with parkland dedication is municipalities tend not to want to use it for what are called hazard lands. They say, oh, we can, just rely on zoning. We don't need to use parkland dedication money to protect these areas. We're going to use all this money for ball pitch fields and soccer fields, and not interested in protecting these areas. This is these wetlands are within urban boundaries, a lot of large forests. Parkland dedication should be used to acquire them from the developers that own them, because they're always trying to change the wetland policy to allow them to be developed, and they need to be acquired, put in the right hands as soon as possible.
I don't know if Tia is still on the call. I think she is, but there was a great example in Welland that happened recently. So the developer had a piece of property and it had a woodland on it that had a wetland in the woodland. And as the first phase of his development, he got permission to go in and remove the small wetland. And that was because it wasn't provincially significant. There was, nobody stood in his way. So he got rid of the small wetland. In the second phase of his project, he asked to remove the woodland. And the woodland had been listed as a significant woodland. But when he requested to have it removed, it was evaluated and they said, well, it was really the wetland that was part of the woodland that made it significant. And now that the wetland's gone, the woodland doesn't matter anymore. So they took the woodland. Right, Tia? Tia's nodding. Yeah. So this is how we keep losing things. They do it in bits and pieces. they find ways to, well, we're just going to go in and take down the dead ash, and then they take down some other significant trees while they're in it. And then the next thing you know, they evaluate the woodland and say, oh, well, it doesn't have the species that it used to have, so it's not significant anymore. We keep nibbling away at what we have when we should be trying to protect. We should be doing everything we can to protect what we have now. And if that means buying it, as John is suggesting, which I don't think is a bad idea, we should be doing that. But we should be doing everything we can to protect what we have now and stop this constant nibbling away at the little bit that remains.
Thank you, Liz. Tia, you're trying to say something, but I think you got to unmute yourself and then you can comment.
There you go. Liz, that goes back to your point about the environmental impact study being purchased by the developer. So they go in and they cater to the developer. They say, no, it's fine, it's fine. So you had a really good point in the past about maybe the city should be in charge of the EIS or somebody else. So they're not beholden to the developer, to cater to the developer's needs.
That would take a change at the provincial level, but and we won't get it under the current government. But at some point in time, we need to bring that to provincial attention. What should happen is it should be the municipality or the regional government who hires all the people that are needed to do the study. The developer gets billed for it, but it's the region or the municipality that hires the people that does the study. Because right now, as you just said, they're working for the developer. And what are the chances they're going to get more work from developers if they find significant things that can't be developed?
And just so everyone knows this, one of the most outrageous examples of this happened recently at Thundering Waters. The developer's EIS said there were no rare honey locust trees on the land they wanted to develop. They claimed they were all in the significant wetland that was protected from development. This came up in the tree saving plan that they were required to do. But I brought that to Niagara Falls Planning Department attention. They're not going to change. I did. They refused to change the design of the subdivision, so they allowed development approved on the basis of lies of the developer.
Yeah. Thank you, John. It is, we're past 8:30 now. Wally, you've had your hand up ever so patiently for a little while. Go ahead.
I've posted a couple of links, as you mentioned. I believe both examples are in Japan, where just click on the links and you'll see actually a mature tree being transported by a transport truck right through the streets of Japan. I think it might have been Tokyo. In any case, as Liz has pointed out, there's a huge discrepancy between how trees are valued here and in other places. I seem to recall an anecdote where the Japanese have actually bought into our stock of cedar trees and sunk them. I believe it was in Tokyo Harbor, if I'm not mistaken. So as long as we're prepared to sell, other cultures are going to buy our resources. We're going to be out a couple of forests, and they're quite happy to buy at the current prices that we are selling at, which does not adequately value the trees as a resource. So one of the reasons I chose to run for regional council instead of local council this time around is because the region has a tree bylaw, and it's unlikely, in my view, that the town of Pelham is likely to get one that also covers the trees on private property. So if the tree bylaw at the regional level can be strengthened, I think we can achieve a lot of our goals.
Thank you, Wally. And last comment to the iPhone with her hand up.
Okay. Am I unmuted? No.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi. Okay. Sorry, I was late arriving to the meeting and this may have come up, but it follows well on what Wally said. The tree bylaws, definitely both at the municipal and the regional level, do have to be strengthened, but we also have to have some way. You can strengthen it all you want, but if it has no teeth, if there's no one to enforce it, then it's a lot of work with not a lot of results, I guess. So how do we go about having better oversight and possibly more effective, I don't know, penalties, I guess, for like total disregard of those bylaws, which happens all the time.
So one of the things that Oakville did when they implemented their bylaw, they contacted all the arborists and all the tree removal companies in the entire area. And they made them aware of what the bylaw in Oakville was, and also what the penalties were for flouting the bylaw. And I believe, I may be wrong about this, but I believe that the penalties could also go to who cut the tree, not just who asked for the tree to be cut. So that was one thing that helped ensure that guidelines were followed, because most homeowners cannot take, or most developers for that matter, cannot go out there with a chainsaw and take a big tree down by themselves. But you're right, we have to have enforcement. So we have to have bylaw enforcement officers who will enforce the bylaws. And that goes for all bylaws, but especially tree bylaws. And that was part of creating the bylaw and part of the expense of creating the bylaw, and what the permits for tree removals were supposed to compensate for was the staffing required to enforce the bylaw.
And
One-
how effective has that been for Oakville?
It was effective, but the original bylaw that we fought for in the beginning wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, because we did it by committee and they put people who were adamantly opposed to the bylaw on the committee. So it was a good bylaw, it wasn't a great bylaw, but they've subsequently made it a lot tougher. I think what they realized was, despite the bylaw, they were still losing trees, and Oakville has a canopy goal of 40% by 2050. And so they realized they couldn't achieve that goal if they were still at a net loss of trees. So that's why they toughened their bylaw.
Can I also ask one more question? I'm sorry, I kind of at the area where you were discussing, like, were you talking about like a crowdfunding thing to be able to purchase these lands that are left with tree canopy? Was that one of the topics of conversation, or I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that, so.
Yeah, we hadn't talked about crowdfunding, but we had talked about money that municipalities get when they don't. Okay, so developers are supposed to provide a certain amount of parkland when they create a development. I think
Yes.
it's like 5% of the total land. But often towns will take money in lieu of that parkland. So they'll allow the developer to develop that 5%, and they'll take money in lieu for that. And I think what was being suggested is the money that they take for that should go to buying woodland, parkland, hazard land, land to create more public space in the community.
Okay, and I can make just an observation. I'm out here in South Ottawa. I'm considered rural. We had all kinds of land banking happening. I think that was done in anticipation of the region expanding their urban boundaries much further than they've already expanded them. Now, all those properties are coming back up for sale again, because all of those speculators now have to wait until 2050 before they can realize any return on their investment, basically.
Mhm.
So wondering if, again, with a new council coming in, that if we can support folks who, maybe look favorably on this type of a a purchasing kind of idea, that it may be a good opportunity for that now, because the prices of everything have also started to trend down. So I don't know. I don't know if that's something that, you know, I think it's definitely something that is worth pursuing if we can, and how to do that. I guess we just have to talk with our candidates and find out where they stand on these issues.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that is why I advocated for a Better Niagara to actually engage in a ranking of the candidates, half a year ago. I'm pleased to see that Herb seems to have taken this task on. So if we can publish and publicize and possibly even rank candidates according to the goals that we set when the time comes in the last couple of weeks, before the election, when people actually get serious and start researching this stuff, they're going to have access to a ready source of reliable information on where the candidates stand on these issues. And that's probably the best cost benefit for effort engaged in this that we're possibly going to get. So just to clarify the public record, I am totally supportive of these environmental goals. I'm running for region, and feel free to spread that piece of information. Thank you.
It's to be clear, I've got the email lists for a lot of the candidates, including yours. The thought of, I like the idea of ranking candidates. For me to rank 256 candidates is an astonishingly daunting task, especially because I've got a full-time job. So how we would go about doing that is quite something. We're also at now 8:45. Liz, how are you feeling? Do you want to keep the conversation going, or where are you at? I know that I'm going to be checking out, so I'm going to have to turn off the record button. I'm willing to leave this on so that you guys can keep on talking. I don't want to obligate Liz to anything since you were the presenter. So how are you at, Liz?
So what I would say is, if anyone wants to ask questions or continue the conversation with me, you're welcome to get in touch with me. And the best way to do that is at Biodiversity and Climate Action Niagara. So the email address for that is bcacniagara@gmail.com. I'm just going to type it into the chat. So that's my email address. Anyone is welcome to contact me to discuss anything that you'd like to discuss. I should mention that Biodiversity and Climate Action Niagara is a collective of 21 groups around Niagara and a whole bunch of individuals, and 50 by 30 Niagara is a part of that collective. And we all work together. We worked really hard together to get the region to adopt the best possible option for the natural heritage system. And we have a lot more things that we're going to be advocating for. So if you don't know about Biodiversity and Climate Action Niagara, you can also send me an email and I'll send you some information about it.
All right. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you guys again. All the best, and yeah, take care. Till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.